So China, just before I get into agriculture, it's interesting. China only has one animal protection law. It's the wildlife protection law, and that's it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And it's been a long day, and I'm glad you're not totally presentationed out. So I appreciate you being here. So close to dinner, too. So thank you so much, again, for taking the time to come to this presentation. I have a habit of coming across issues in my work that sort of like gnaw at me. I see one example of it, and I'll say, oh, that really bothers me, and then I'll start to notice it in other areas, and this is definitely one of those things. The sort of misconception that animal protection laws, we call them animal protection laws, and they don't really protect animals at all, so where does that leave animals? And I am largely going to talk about farming today because that's my thing. I work at Farm Sanctuary, but I will touch on other issues as well. So to get started, I think that most people in societies would say that they're animal lovers, and that means different things to different people, of course. But a recent survey put out by the media outlet Vox said that approximately 75% of people they polled deemed themselves an animal lover. And I think a lot of that comes from companion animals, right? Love our companion animals. Here is a picture on the left of my husband and I, our cat Elba, and she is looking out over the Hudson River in New York in our apartment. We have 9 cats that we share our home with. We're those people. So I certainly appreciate the love of companion animals, and that many people probably associate their animal loving with the love of companion animals. This next part of the poll isn't something I associate with because I've been vegan for 23 years. But those polled who were not vegan or vegetarian, 80% still believed in the humane treatment of animals for farming. Now, many of us will probably say, if they're being farmed, they're not being treated humane. You can't have those things together. But assuming for a minute that someone might find the idea of exploiting animals acceptable, whether that be for food or research or entertainment or clothing or whatever, any of the million ways that we exploit animals in society, but they want to make sure they're treated humanely. And that's really interesting to think about. And the other thing about that is we have laws in place. I'm going to talk about the US, but I'm going to talk about other places too. And everywhere has laws in place that seem like they're about protecting animals. So if you feel comfortable exploiting animals, maybe you're okay with eating your steak or going to the aquarium because you think the government has these animals back. There are laws in place that protect their welfare when these things are happening. So obviously, I think everyone in this room probably agrees that that is flawed logic. One of the main motivation or problems behind this is the laws are rarely about animal protection. So most laws that we classify as animal protection laws are really more just about protecting profit or marketability, maybe human health, but even that usually ties back to profit. And any protection that animals are afforded is almost an accident or a byproduct. And if they could figure out another way to achieve their objectives without providing welfare for animals, they probably would do it. In addition, the mission of the agencies often tasked with enforcing these laws, not only are they not motivated by animal welfare or prioritize animal welfare, but sometimes their mission is even at odds with animal welfare. I generally think that if your mission is money-driven, true animal welfare is probably going to clash with that. And I think that's what we'll find a lot with the agencies I talk about today. So as a result, both the creators and the enforcers of the law are driven by objectives that do not include prioritizing animal protection. So with all of this in mind, how can we expect animal protection laws to adequately protect animals? And I think this is a really important issue to bring to light because, again, I do think the average person thinks we have laws out there that are protecting animals. And so they're okay with exploiting. Again, many of us in this room are not okay with any sort of exploitation. But if those people have made peace with the fact that there's some level of exploitation going on, they're okay with that, but they want the animals treated well, then they're resting assured. These laws exist. And the laws on the surface look great. Like I'm going to talk about the Animal Welfare Act. It's right there in the title, welfare. So it sounds like they're protecting animals, and they're not, and we'll talk about that. But if you're looking at it from a surface point of view, like many people are, you think it's fine, So that's partially why I think this is an important issue to bring up, to sort of point to those laws, point to the real agenda, point to who's enforcing it or why it's not being enforced, and then talk about, like, what can we do instead. So going into the United States, I'm going to talk about Animal Welfare Act briefly, the 28-hour law, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. There's that word again. Protection. All three of these laws have the same defects I just alluded to, driven by profitability, marketability, and the entities tasked with enforcement have no interest in animal welfare at all. So looking quickly at the Animal Welfare Act, this is the only federal law in the United States that governs the treatment of animals in research facilities and some other places, but that's the main place. The Animal Welfare Act is enforced by APHIS, which is a part of the United States Department of Agriculture. And I'll talk more about APHIS in a minute, but just keep in mind that I said that APHIS oversees the Animal Welfare Act. Now, if you look at the definition of animal, it's pretty comprehensive, so that sounds good. So you think, okay, so these animals are being used in research, and you're maybe a person who's okay with that. I'm not okay with that, but you're a person who's okay with that, so you think, okay, but they're being taken care of. There's this Welfare Act. But of course, the problem is the Animal Welfare Act excludes rats, birds, and mice, and some other animals from its definition of animal. And rats, birds, and mice make up more than 95% of the animals used in research. So the Animal Welfare Act is created to put welfare requirements in place for animals used in research, but it excludes 95% of the animals used in research. So how crazy is that? Looking at the 28-hour law. The 28-hour law is the only federal law in the United States that mandates the amount of time an animal can transport to slaughter, among other things. So the rule is an animal can be transported for up to 28 hours at one time, and then they have to be offloaded for 5 hours for food, water, and rest. Now, this law by itself is horrendous. 28 hours? Like, that's insane. In the EU, as you probably are all aware, we're in the EU, it's 8 hours and 24-hour rest. So this is worse than flip-flopping the EU law. Now, there's enforcement issues in the EU, and that's a whole other presentation, but the 28-hour just on paper is terrible, right? So even on top of that, it excludes the 9 billion birds slaughtered for food every year in the United States because, like the Animal Welfare Act, birds are excluded from the definition of animal in the 28-hour law. It also only applies to travel going directly to slaughter facilities. So if the transport vehicle is going somewhere else on the way, 28-hour law doesn't apply. It also excludes air and sea travel. And it also only applies to travel from Canada or Mexico for cows. And why is that? Because the United States likes cows more? No, it's because they have found that these horrendously long transport times can be connected to mad cow disease. And they don't like mad cow disease because it makes people horribly ill and they lose money. So because of that, you're supposed to follow the 28-hour law if you're transporting cows, but if you're transporting pigs or other ruminants, you don't have to follow it. And of course, you don't have to follow it for birds because there's been no horrible epidemic that's hurting the bottom line tied to long transport times for those animals. So other problems with the 28-hour law, there's a bunch of ways that a transporter can get out of it lawfully, basically just by asking. But one wonders why they'd even bother, because enforcement is non-existent. Even for multiple offenders, the most that usually happens is they get a letter in the mail saying, hey, you violated the 28-hour law, don't do that, and that's pretty much the extent of it. If they received a penalty, the maximum penalty on the 28-hour law violation is $500 per occurrence. An occurrence is a truckload of animals. So if you're a transporter and you have some big lucrative contract with a slaughter facility or a producer or whoever, you're going to be much more concerned with meeting that deadline than you were about some silly $500 fine that you may or may not, probably won't incur anyway. So basically the penalty is worthless. And the agencies tasked with enforcement do not prioritize animal welfare at all. There are 3 agencies that oversee the 28-hour law. It's the Department of Transportation, the Department of Justice, and the USDA, again. And APHIS, here's APHIS again, they oversee the 28-hour law, and actually that's who you would bring a violation to. So let's look at APHIS, because I mentioned it earlier when talking about the Animal Welfare Act. This is APHIS's mission, is to work in a variety of ways to protect and improve the health, quality, and marketability of our nation's animals. Now, when they say health, they don't mean the health of the animal. They mean they don't want diseases so that people get sick from eating diseased meat. That's what they're talking about with health. So it's not the health of the animal, like, don't confuse health with welfare. I guess that's what I'm saying. So this is APHIS's mission. You can see there's nothing about animal protection, nothing about animal welfare. And yet this is the entity that's tasked with overseeing the 28-hour law and the Animal Welfare Act. And why would you put an agency who doesn't care about animal welfare in charge of a law that we're deeming an animal protection law? Because it's not an animal protection law. So what does this mean for animals transported in agriculture in the US? Nothing good. Obviously, it's horrible, and many die in transport. Here's some stats put out by the Humane League, just to give you an idea. They don't even survive the transport because it's so bad. So 28-hour law takeaways, I get really fired up about the 28-hour law, so I appreciate you humoring me. It's so horrendous. 28-hour law takeaways, it's not created to provide higher welfare. Clearly, it's provided to get those animals to slaughter who are just healthy enough to be slaughtered and sold. That's it. That's the goal, is nothing to do with welfare. Exists only to protect profit, productivity, maybe human health, and it's not enforced, and those tasked with enforcement do not prioritize animal welfare. That's pretty clear. So we're going to switch gears. I'm going to go away from farming briefly, and we're going to talk about the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was created in 1972, and in fairness, it was in response to public outcry for mistreatment of marine mammals. There was excessive whale hunting, and there was excessive marine mammal bycatch, secondary especially to purse-line fishing of tuna. People were upset, and the government created the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So that all sounds pretty good. And the basic definition, or the basic prohibition under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, is it prevents a taking, which you can see the definition of taking here. But in simplest terms, it's killing marine mammals. But there's exceptions, of course. So many exceptions to the prohibition, and some of them are allowed for research, display. We're going to talk about live captive display in a little bit, bycatch of industrial fishing, or when a taking is supporting conservation principles, which I would love to know when that is. And while it still seemed like a good idea at the time, over the years, the Marine Mammal Protection Act has continued to get chipped away. So those exemptions and exclusions have gotten bigger and bigger. And in 1981, they allowed the taking of marine mammals on an incidental basis for some US fishers not previously afforded the allowance. So basically, they're telling commercial fishers, more of them, that it's okay to kill marine mammals in the process of doing business. And again, moratoriums are replaced with exemptions, allowing for this greater leniency for commercial fishing operations. Now, here's the enforcement, which is my favorite part of this presentation, is getting to the enforcement. So the USDA, in 1994, the industry who was doing live captive animal display was complaining that the Marine Mammal Protection Act was like cutting into their work. So the government, in response, put the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, in charge of the live captive animal display. And basically, they're in charge of enforcing that rule and overseeing it. So what does the USDA know about marine mammals? Nothing. What do they know about live captive animal display? Nothing. I would liken this to the parents who are going out for dinner, and they're leaving the teenage brother at home to take care of the little brother or sister. It's just a body who's there that they can say is in charge. But that person has no intention of enforcing anything or actually doing anything. That is exactly what this is. The USDA is there so they can say someone is in charge, but that someone, knowing full well that someone is not actually going to do anything. Now, the majority of the Marine Mammal Protection Act is overseen by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So let's look at them. So first of all, NOAA is controlled by the US Department of Commerce, which means they're controlled by money. That's their thing, is money. And if you read the mission, obviously nothing about welfare. Its concern is the supporting of marine commerce. And then on the site, it also brags that its products and services support economic vitality and affect more than 1/3 of America's gross domestic product. So there's nothing about animal welfare or animal protection or even anything remotely related to that just a dedication to economic vitality and marine commerce. So is it a surprise that those who oversee the Marine Mammal Protection Act continue to get the commercial fishers more and more leniency away from complying with the Marine Mammal Protection Act? Because they're in it for the money, and the money is where the commercial fishing is. Oh, we're moving on to Brazil. But let me just complain about the US for one more second. So with that in mind, this is a law that was created supposedly to protect marine mammals, and it seems like it kind of was in the very beginning. But now we have these entities in charge who are worried about controlling the thing that is killing the marine mammals. So we got work to do in the US. But while the US is kind of leading the way in horrible laws and complete lack of enforcement, there are other countries I want to point to, and this is just illustrative. This is a problem across the world. No one's doing it perfectly, that's for sure. So let's look at Brazil. Brazil's really interesting because animal protection is enshrined in the Constitution. I mean, that's awesome. I wish that was true in the US. And in relevant part, it reads, all practices which represent a risk to the ecological function, cause the extinction of species or subject animals to cruelty, shall be prohibited by law. Wow, that sounds great. Animals must be living it up in Brazil. But Brazil is also the largest exporter of beef in the world, with the largest commercial cattle herd in the world, and the largest exporter of poultry in the world. So I'm not sure how that adds up with the Constitution that's prohibiting animal cruelty. And to do all of its work, Brazil largely works with concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, factory farms, to get their job done. Even the smaller farms feed into the CAFOs, so it's all about the CAFOs. And there's 3 huge CAFO companies in Brazil. That would be JBS, Marfrig, and Minerva. JBS is in the news like every other day, doing horrible things to their workers, the animals. They're just kind of being shady in general, yet they're still doing really great. And they're all doing this in Brazil, where the Constitution prohibits animal cruelty. So agriculture is overseen in Brazil by the Department of Agriculture, Livestock, and Food Supply, or MAPA, and you can see their mission here. And you can see the mission is pretty heavy on agribusiness. That's the concern with MAPA, nothing about animal welfare. So it's not surprising that the actual legislation that governs requirements around animal welfare and farming are very few and far between and not enforced in Brazil. MAPA does put out some basic guidelines, but here's some examples of the actual laws that address each aspect of agriculture. So with regard to rearing, here is the decree that governs that. You can see it's very vague, and there's no specific legislation that addresses the rearing of pigs, hens, chickens, or cattle raised for meat. And then we look at transport, which technically governs the movement of the animals, but it has no definitive welfare standards at all. And then we look at slaughter. There's actually a decree and a normative instruction, which is also binding in Brazil. And it just kind of states you have to handle them with minimal distress, whatever that means. And they recommend stunning, but it's not required. Then we go to enforcement, my favorite part. So MAPA advises that the states and municipalities all have full autonomy regarding these laws and the practices. So basically MAPA is saying, we're not going to worry about it, it's your problem. And these local municipalities, I'm sure, have plenty of things to worry about, and I'm guessing the treatment of farmed animals in those communities is not top of list. So the answer to that is it's probably not being enforced at all, if these rules are even being implemented. Also in Brazil, not all of the normative instructions have sanctions in place, so while they are binding, if there's no sanction, where's the motivation to actually comply? And finally, the Federal Inspection Service is responsible for monitoring and inspecting the slaughterhouses, but their inspectors have only been trained to look at sanitation issues. They do not look at welfare issues at all, and they have not been trained in welfare. So even if an inspector had some inkling to be concerned about welfare, they wouldn't know what they're looking for. So it would be very ineffective. So it's kind of amazing in Brazil. They have animal protection enshrined in the Constitution. They do a ton of animal agriculture work, and they have no laws to protect those animals, or the laws they do are clearly not about actually protecting animals. So now we're going to move across the world to China. Sorry, it's a whirlwind. So China, just before I get into agriculture, it's interesting. China only has one animal protection law. It's the Wildlife Protection Law, and that's it. And the Wildlife Protection Law is supposed to help preserve species and biodiversity, but in my reading of it, it's the same old thing where it's really more about preserving trade, preserving sustainability just for the purpose of exploiting those animals. Because if you exploit them to extinction, then they're not there to exploit anymore, and then we lose money. So, but looking at agriculture, agriculture is overseen by the Ministry of Agricultural and Rural Affairs, and you can see their job here, which is very sort of administrative. But basically, they're looking out for the farmers, and they seem mostly concerned with making sure they're doing their job and making sure the import and export is working, the taxes are in order, all the money stuff. So money and farmers seems to be the focus of the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, obviously nothing about animal welfare. The main law that governs animal husbandry in China is the Animal Husbandry Law of the People's Republic of China. It's a very long law, and there is nothing about welfare requirements for specific animals in this law anywhere. In fact, I did a search for the word welfare I'm going to refer to it as the law, by the way. I did a research for the word welfare in the law, and it came up one time in Article 38, and they were referring to human public welfare. So welfare is literally not even in this document. So let's look more specifically. We can see what this law is really about. Article 1 kind of sets the tone for the mission or purpose of this law, and it talks about guaranteeing the quality and safety of livestock and poultry products. Remember, that's not the animal's safety, that's the safety of those eating it. And also to safeguard the lawful rights and interests of the producers and operators. So that all seems pretty consistent with what we read about the ministry. And then looking at Article 42, I just thought was interesting. Its emphasis is on the survival and growing of livestock and poultry. So survival and growing says to me that this is like the absolute bare minimum we can do to make sure these animals make it across the product finish line so we can make money off of them. Welfare is certainly not survival and growing. I mean, that is bottom of the barrel. So looking specifically at some of the more aspects of the law, there is a section on transport, Article 53, and it does talk about making sure they have food and space and all of that. But the whole purpose of Article 53 is to animal epidemic prevention. That's it. And case in point about that is they enacted additional laws recently about pigs, and that is secondary to the African swine fever epidemic that has ravaged the Chinese pig industry and they ended up killing hundreds of millions of pigs. So they have additional rules about pigs in transport because that was a problem and they were losing money. The other animals, not so much, so they're not that worried about it. But the whole purpose of the transport is to talk about epidemics, not about the welfare or the safety of the animals. And then slaughter is not even mentioned in the law, but the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs has recommended stunning, but not because it's good for the animals or better for the animals, but because it promotes worker safety, which would be all well and good, I guess, but this is an industry that definitely doesn't care about its workers. So I'm thinking that's not going to be a big priority in these slaughterhouses, particularly if stunning is going to slow down the product line. And then enforcement. Article 67 of the law just basically says that if 43 is violated, the penalties will be imposed. But it doesn't really say what they are. And Article 43 is really vague. I put it up here, you can take a look. But it's just, I mean, it really doesn't say anything. So it'd be pretty hard to break Article 43. Okay, so I'd be remiss to not mention a global treaty if I'm attempting to a global presentation. So this is a treaty that has gnawed at me ever since I learned about it. This is the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, CITES. So CITES is a global agreement, and the stated purpose is to preserve species of flora and fauna from extinction. And the way they propose doing that is to ban illegal wildlife trade. That's the focus. There's 184 members in CITES, known as the Conference of the Parties. They meet every 3 years. And there's over 37,000 species of flora and fauna in the appendices for CITES. So looking at the appendices, each level, it has a different level of protection. So Appendix 1 is, and you see it right here, it's supposed to be the world's most endangered plants and animals. So if you heard that, wouldn't you think, okay, well, we're not touching them with a 10-foot pole. Like, under no circumstances are these animals to be exploited because they are in trouble. Nope. International commercial trade is generally not allowed, but they will make exceptions for scientific research. So even these animals that are the most threatened animals on the planet, and plants, I should say, on the planet, they're still leaving the door open to some kind of exploitation. Appendix 2 are animals that aren't there yet, but they will be if we keep trading them in an unlimited fashion. So this one allows for commercial trade. It just has some additional restrictions. And then Appendix 3 is just for animals in a particular country where the country feels like it needs help sort of managing the population. So it will call on CITES to sort of help them out. So these are the three. And then to confuse things further, there's something called split listing, where one animal can end up on two lists. So then what do you do, right? So the animal that's currently on 2, they're currently on Appendix 1, and Appendix 2 is the African elephant, just depending on where they reside. So again, CITES' aim is to ensure international trade in the species of wild animals and plants and does not threaten the survival of the species. That sounds great, but I would propose that CITES is more about prohibiting illegal trade, not because it's threatening the animals, at least not in the way that you and I would think, but because if they threaten those animals, then legal trade isn't going to be able to exploit them, and they're going to lose money. And they also don't like that illegal trade is cutting into their money, even with the animals that are still existing. So that's the motivation. It's not really to try to protect the survival of the species for species' sake, for biodiversity, all of that. At least I don't think so. So the reality is preserving wildlife for the purpose of profit, and more about protecting trade than about protecting wildlife. And the other example of that is CITES has enforcement and sanction protocols in place, but they're rarely employed. So if one of the members violates CITES, often nothing actually happens. Okay, so what can we do now I've thoroughly depressed you? It's not all bad news. So one thing, and I always say this every presentation I give, no matter what it's on, we need to promote public awareness. We need to educate the public. This is a room full of people who are very dedicated to animal rights. I don't doubt it. I am, you are. But even with that in mind, how many people knew absolutely 100% every single thing I told you in this presentation? You didn't learn anything new. Right, so this is a room that knows what they're talking about, and you still learn new things. I learned new things. I didn't know about China only having one animal protection law, because that is the saddest stat. So why would we think that the average public is going to know? They're not going to know any of this. In my experience with the average public, especially because I talk a lot about farming, they think they know, but they don't know. They have no idea, and it's always very eye-opening. So we need to educate the public. And then some people say, oh, but they don't really care. I don't think that's true. And here's a survey that was put out that said 80% of people in China and the US indicated that they were concerned about the welfare and treatment of farm animals. Are they still eating them? Yes. Is that a problem? Yes. But they're stating that they're concerned, and they probably don't know the half of it. I guarantee they don't. And it's the same about the Brazilians. 9 out of 10 said that they cared about farm animal welfare. So let's use that. We want to give the public, educate the public with what is actually going on, because you know the industry is not going to tell them. And then we want to give them a voice, give them a way to use their voice. Now, in the United States, some states allow for voter initiative laws. So that means that if people are going to the polls because they're voting for a candidate, you can get a question put on that ballot. And depending on if people say yes or no, and whatever the majority is, a new law can just be born, just like that. And the one that's most well-known recently is Proposition 12 in California. It has a whole bunch of welfare requirements for farmed animals in California and for any products being sold or brought into California. And it passed overwhelmingly because people had the chance to do something. So it passed overwhelmingly, and then it went all the way up to the Supreme Court because the industry was challenging it. Farm Sanctuary was part of the case. And the Supreme Court upheld it and said, the people want this, so we're going to uphold it. And we're running into the same thing in Massachusetts right now. It's called Question 3. It's basically the same thing as Prop 12, and we're getting the same challengers from the exact same people making the same arguments. So that was really a chance to give people a voice, and you can't do that everywhere. I understand that. Even in the US, you can't do it everywhere, but it's a great option if you have it. If you don't have that option, corporate engagement is really a great option. The Joe Chicken Company is not going to listen to me. I've been vegan for 23 years, and I've been vegetarian for 26. I started 3 years before. So I haven't eaten chicken in a very long time, and I don't think the chicken company is going to care if I say, hey, you need to change your policies. But they might care if the person actually eating chicken cares. So you want to educate people and then encourage them to go to these companies. And you can say, oh, that would never work. It actually does work. There are enforcement issues, but it actually does work. Companies actually do change their policies. Now, it's not abolition. We all long for abolition. But it's something. So, and that's where the public is, you know. So give them a voice, educate them, and then give them something they can do. And then we want to create animal welfare-specific laws. Easier said than done, but obviously we want laws that are actually intended to benefit animals and not, like Proposition 12, that exists to benefit animals. And now that law exists. It's not just a cover-up. It's not, oh, we're trying to do this, and the animals, we're like forced to give them welfare because we won't get our job done otherwise. This is like really about welfare. So we want to keep doing that in whatever capacity. And then we also want to increase enforcement for existing laws. These laws are pathetic. The 28-hour law is pathetic. It's a horrible law. And we don't even enforce that. Like, that's crazy. So we need to find, either get different government entities in there to enforce the law, or we need to just hold them accountable. I mean, it's something. I mean, it's just insane. And most importantly, and I don't think anyone in this room would do this anyway, but we do not want to assume these current laws are enough. Obviously, they're not. Hopefully, that's been clear today. But really, the point of this presentation is to just show that we don't want to ever get complacent, and we don't want the public to get complacent. And we're the ones who have this information. So we need to help them understand what's happening, and we need to help them take a stand against it. And that's kind of what this is about, not resting on these horrible animal protection laws that aren't about animal protection at all. And those are my references, and that's it. And I'll be here, and you can always email me at Farm Sanctuary as well. Thank you so much.